Welcome to the second session for today. My name is Tobias Bonacki. I'm normally a researcher in Russian disinformation, and I'm chairing the Nordic think tank for tech and democracy, which I will come back to later. For today, I will be your guide the next hour and a half, where we're going to dive into these many different regulations that have come the last few years and how they impact our discourse, the existing actors, and most importantly, our democracy. So I think we've all witnessed the last few years that the landscape that we knew has changed dramatically. When I was a little kid, I used to go out and watch Viaplay, which will be on stage a little later, and their shows, and that would be like my only access to the outside world. Today, I just turn on my phone, even while someone is speaking up here, and I'm connected to the rest of the world. That also means changes in legislation, and changes is which actors are actually dominating our area. But what are the new legal framework targeting the media and tech sectors? And even more importantly, how does they impact media actors and shape our democratic discussion? That will be the topic of the next 1 hour and a half. We'll start off with a keynote by Arba Kokalari, more or less, right? She's from the EU Parliament and is one of the negotiators of the upcoming DSA. And she will provide us with insight into the development of the DSA. Arba will be followed by Eleonora Rosati, who is a professor from Stockholm University, and who will provide us with an overview of the many new upcoming legislation. At that point, I will leave my role as a moderator and give a short introduction to the Nordic think tank for tech and democracy, and some insight into how this alliance of the Nordic countries are trying to navigate the post-DSA era. We'll then broaden out the discussion and invite representatives from Spotify and Viaplay and YouTube to come up here and give us some concrete examples of how the new EU regulation are impacting the democratic discourse from their perspective. And now comes the most important part, because after a few questions, we'll open up the floor and allow you guys to ask some questions. I have also prepared some more aggressive questions for the people sitting up here, but I think it will make a bad atmosphere. So I really hope that you guys will stop me and join into the dialogue yourself. Finally, I have to say we are a very broad panel and we are a big audience, so I'll try to be a friendly but also very strict moderator. So don't take it personal if I break you off. And with that said, I'll give the stage to Arba Kokalari.
Thank you very much, Tobias. I want to especially thank the Swedish government and Parisa Liljestrand and Karin Sjöborg for inviting me for this conference, and also for arranging this very important conference about tech and media and democracy, crucial issues in how we will form our societies in the future. As Tobias said, I was one of the head negotiators of the Digital Services Act, and I'm also the only Swedish member of the European Parliament sitting in the Internal Market Committee, where the DSA was handled. We've spoken here, several other speakers before have spoken how important the digital life and internet has been for our societies and also for freedom and also for our ways to communicate. But we've also seen the challenges and the risks that the digital services and the internet have evolved. And the reason for the Digital Services Act was that we need to handle the fact that our citizens are not, they don't feel safe anymore online. Businesses don't feel safe anymore. Medias don't feel safe anymore. So we had to try to tackle this digital Wild West that had been evolved in many of the platforms online. And hate speech, fraud, disinformation, foreign interference, flow of illegal products and illegal content is something that has been too much of a daily life online. And our life is too much online. So what we have had as a regulation was the e-commerce directive, and it was over 20 years old from a European level, and we've had several member states in the European Union who said, okay, we want to do something about these things on platforms nationally, which means that if that would have been the case, then we would have 27 different laws when it comes to digital services, and then our digital internal market would have been basically destroyed. So we had over 20-year-old law. Back then when that law was made, we didn't have any Facebook or Twitter. We had some online shopping, but we needed to find a balance. And for me, as a legislator, the most difficult thing was to balance three things. Firstly, to make sure that our citizens and users online felt safer when they were shopping online and when they were using social media online. So basically, social media and shopping online, that was the two main focus areas on the DSA. Secondly, we needed to protect freedom of speech online. People have spoken here that, well, we have to stop all bad things in the internet. The problem is, if we were trying to do that, then we would become China, controlling and censoring what people were saying online. That's something that I would never accept. So freedom of speech online and increasing the transparency and the user power was also a key thing. And thirdly, to make sure that we had a fair competition on these digital services. So also smaller tech platforms could have the ability to compete with the big ones. And that we have one set of rules instead of 27 different set of rules. Because we're living also in a global challenge where other countries, other regions are becoming more digital competitive than Europe. And then we need to have a good competition to thrive the digitalization as well. So I'm happy that we managed, I would say, find that balance. I was afraid before, were we really going to make this happen? But I think in the end, after the negotiation, we managed to get that balance. And I think now the biggest changes people will see is that hopefully, if the implementation works well, that illegal content will be taken down more quickly than before. The power of content and transparency on algorithm will be increased, so users, both consumers but also media users, would be able to contest why the biggest platform are taking down content just arbitrary. And I think that one thing that occurred in the end of the negotiations was that during when we were forming the DSA, two big things happened. Firstly was the COVID pandemic and a big flow of disinformation about the vaccines. And the second was the war, the illegal war that Russia made in Ukraine, which also put a light on the Russian disinformation online. So what happened was that these two factors also added on a crisis mechanism in the DSA, where the biggest platform need to take even bigger responsibility and even bigger measurements to mitigate risks, fundamental risks on their platforms. And I think in the end that I hope that the DSA will be a worldwide example for tech regulation, for a digital future, that it will be both open, innovative, and also safe, and that I believe that we can combine those. So I'm happy that the DSA is a good legislation. Please let me know if the implementation is not good. And I hope that the future more sectoral legislation that the European Union right now is starting to negotiate will take the spirit of the DSA to be balanced and proportionate. If we don't, then the spirit of the DSA might be challenged or, well, threatened. So looking forward to discussions in the panel, and thank you for the word.
Thank you, Ava. Next face up here is Eleonora Rosati, who's a professor at Stockholm University in intellectual law. And she will try to broaden up the scope from the DSA and give us an introduction to the many other different regulations.
Thank you very much, Tobias. Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to start, of course, by thanking the Swedish Presidency for the honor of inviting me to be part of today and tomorrow's discussion. So, in the time at my disposal, I've been asked to provide a stock-taking of recent EU tech regulation. And in the few minutes that I have at my disposal, I would like to indeed provide a quick snapshot of some of the legislative initiatives and other types of initiatives, some of which have been mentioned already in the previous panel, that have dominated the EU policy and legislative discourse over the past few years. And then I thought of making an attempt at identifying some shared challenges, threads and trends that emerge from these recent EU tech regulatory efforts. So let's get started with an overview. Something that can be said, borrowing from the adopted in Sweden Finnish Moomin, is that indeed over the past 10 years or so, the European Union has been extremely active insofar as policy and legislative discourse around tech is concerned. I would like also to note another element, that of course the EU policy and lawmakers have not been alone in this effort, and indeed the courts around Europe, including at the level of the Court of Justice of the European Union over the past several years, have also contributed to shaping substantially the legal framework as we have it today. And it is anticipated, also given the complexity of the legislation that's just adopted, that this trend will continue over the next few years. So this is, as you see on the slide, a very minimalistic snapshot of the regulation that has been conceived, debated, and adopted over the past decade or so. I thought of starting in 2012, not just because it is more or less 10 years ago, but because that was the year when the proposal for what will become the GDPR was issued for the first time. And I think that that is a piece of legislation that has not been mentioned yet, but shows a change in the attitude of the European Union, and indeed an ambition that I think was also clear in the speech delivered today by Commissioner Breton of the European Union to take a lead insofar as tech regulation is concerned, and also insofar as the internet is concerned more at large. So 2012 was the year in which the GDPR proposal was released. The regulation then was adopted a few years later in 2016, so it was quite a complex type of legislative discourse. Then in 2015, under the previous commission, there was the release of the Digital Single Market Strategy, from which several pieces of legislation stemmed. Insofar as today's discourse is concerned, for sure that is the case of the review of the Audiovisual Media Service Directive, but also, and here I take the liberty, being an IP lawyer myself, to mention another very substantial piece of legislation that is the directive on copyright in the digital single market. And I will be explaining a bit more at length why I think that that is also a landmark piece of legislation. That directive was proposed in 2016, was adopted in 2019, and already it has been the object of a landmark decision of the Court of Justice just a few months ago, in which indeed there was an action from the Republic of Poland seeking the annulment of one of the key provisions of the directive, that is Article 17. And if I'm allowed to say so, that is a great effort at regulating the tech environment. Then the VMSD revision was adopted in 2018. Then in 2020 there was Shaping Europe's Digital Future, and then of course the proposals for what will become the DMA and the DSA. In all these, of course, there has been also the Code of Practice on Disinformation, which has just been recently strengthened, and more legislation in the pipeline for the next few months and years. And also for the legislation that has just been adopted, including the DSA and DMA, 2023 will be for sure a substantial year of progress insofar as certain provisions are concerned. So what emerges from all these legislation over the past few years? For sure, the detail, the rationale is very specific if we look at each and every legislative effort on its own. But if there are some points that are common, one for sure is the internal market perspective that underpins all relevant legislation of the European Union in this field. And I would say also an idea of fairness that should be achieved in different ways, including by granting a high level of protection insofar as data protection and privacy are concerned, if we think about the GDPR, insofar as copyright is concerned, insofar as the creation of a trustworthy and safe internet environment is concerned. So all this said, in the few minutes that I've left, I've tried to identify some shared challenges and trends. This is a bit of a smorgasbord of ideas that could be, of course, discussed at greater length during the panel discussion. And they relate to 5 topics: the approach that has been chosen, the method, the scope, so the extension of these legislative efforts, the need for them, and indeed the relation that exists between these different instruments. So let's get started from approach. I think that the DSA is probably the place where to start. It is a regulation that detangles, in a way, questions of responsibility and liability of platforms, search engines, internet actors in general, from questions of accountability. Indeed, the safe harbor system has been reiterated. It was first introduced at the EU level in the Commerce Directive, but now, irrespective of the safe harbor availability, there are for sure due diligence requirements that apply in different ways depending on the type of internet actor at issue. So this is for sure a landmark, I would say, achievement. And the reason is that before that, to some extent, the questions of accountability and responsibility and liability went a bit hand in hand. Let's think, for example, about Article 17 of the DSM Directive, which introduces strengthened accountability because of the liability that online content sharing service providers will be otherwise subject to. However, this is not entirely unprecedented, and I will take once again the example from intellectual property. For several years, there have been indeed in EU law injunctions that are available for right holders to request against innocent intermediaries. So these subjects do not have liability for infringing content, but they are called upon assisting in the enforcement process because they might be best placed to bring infringing activities to an end. So what is now enshrined in a very substantial way in the Digital Services Act is something that I'm not saying that it did not exist before, but probably was not there with the generalized substantial strength that instead is now. Then coming to the method, I would say that something that emerges quite vigorously from the past few years is the increasing visibility of the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union. As you know, this is an instrument that since the Lisbon Reform Treaty has had the status of primary source of EU law on the same level as the EU treaties, and the relevance of the Charter has increasingly become greater and greater. Now there is no preamble to any EU legislation that does not refer to the Charter rights. And what is interesting in all this is that the Charter rights actually have biting teeth. Once again, I would refer to Article 17 of the DSM Directive, which Poland did challenge based on Article 11 of the EU Charter, freedom of expression and information. And the only argument of Poland was that the regime, as found in Article 17, would be contrary to freedom of expression and information. The Court of Justice decided this case just a few months ago and did acknowledge that the argument of Poland was well-founded. It is true that Article 17 does restrict freedom of expression and information. However, the court also identified 6 key safeguards that made it possible to conclude that this compression would be justified. So all this to say that the Charter rights are likely to play an increasingly substantial role in the years to come. And indeed, an interesting data that I think is worth sharing is the one provided by a former Advocate General at the Court of Justice, who noted how, for the time being, 1 out of 5 of all the new cases that the Court of Justice is called upon to decide relate to the Charter rights and freedoms. So indeed, this is something that will be an increasingly pivotal aspect of EU law making and case law as well. Then the extent. Of course, from a policy standpoint, you are all well acquainted with the notion of Brussels effect, this ambition of the European Union to take the lead insofar as tech regulation is concerned. But from a technical lawyerly perspective, this Brussels effect is also relevant from another point of view. And it is the fact that some of the recent tech regulation applies irrespective of where the subject is based or located. So if you take the GDPR, if you take the DSA, if you take the Directive on Copyright in the Digital Single Market, to be caught within the scope of application of those rules, it is not required to be based in the EU, it is not required to have establishment in the European Union, it is sufficient to target the European Union territory, and this shows that this Brussels effect has also great significance from a legal and technical standpoint. 4 points, the need for this influx of tech regulation, and here the aspect that comes to my mind is indeed that of competition law. Some people have called the DMA an antitrust intervention through a regulation, and that for sure has its truth in it. But the DMA is not the only instrument that hides this support to existing rules. And here, since we are speaking about the media sector, I cannot but think of the new related right for press publishers. Also there is clearly an intent to remedy imbalances in the marketplace for press content by empowering press publishers with a new right. And as we have seen from the early experiences at the national level, this new right in itself will not really have any strength if the competition authorities were not willing to step in and help the enforcement of a para-copyright rule. That has been very clearly the case of France, and it is likely to be also the case of Italy. Last but not least, going forward, an important point will be to understand the relation between all these instruments. And here, a trend that we are increasingly seeing is the interplay, but also the complexity of the relation between general lex generalis legislation, as it is, for example, the Digital Services Act, and sector-specific regulation, as it is indeed the rules that we find in relation to copyright, intellectual property, consumer protection, and so on. Now, it all seems clear to determine when what applies, but as the case of copyright, which I'm more familiar with, shows quite well, This is not the case, and indeed determining what is subject to sector-specific regulation and what is instead subject to the lex generalis will be a challenge going forward. And with that, I think I've exhausted my time, so I thank you for your attention and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you to Eleonora. Now I'm going to do something I would normally never do. I'm asked both to give a keynote and be the moderator, and that's a mess up. But I agreed since I was then also allowed to serve you guys dinner and make drinks for you tonight. So that I'm looking very much forward to. So I've been asked to give a short introduction to this initiative called the Nordic Think Tank for Tech and Democracy. And I will start a little other place. So my father has great anxiety for birds. He's always been really afraid of it. And when I was 8 years old, I remember him taking me to bingo, you know, where you turn these things out, in the local community hall in the little city I lived at the countryside. And he took me over there, and I remember he won this huge turkey. And I remember standing there, like he felt like you could see the fear in his eyes standing with this big turkey. The other thing I remember for that bingo night was that for the first time in my life, I met people who had different political opinions. And I remember my father discussing with them very heartily. But there was also like a nice atmosphere. These community halls, which we in Denmark call forsamlingshus or medborgerhus, is spread out all over the Nordics. And they have been there for hundreds of years, where people have met up and discussed politics. And quite recently, it used to be one of the most important platforms for our democratic conversation. Today, this democratic conversation has moved online. We call it the digital community hall. Across Europe, democratic conversations are now unfolding digitally. In a study we conducted a few years ago, 2/3 out of all Danes had at some point interacted directly with a member of parliament in Denmark on Facebook. This is getting very close to the democratic utopians. And I think what this was what Katie earlier talks about was the optimistic period, when we looked at these numbers and saw, wow, this is the real democracy. This is what the Greeks dreamt about. However, in the recent years, the utopians have turned into dystopians. So multiple studies have found that 2 out of 3 Danes now refrain from participating in the online democracy of social media. People seem to be leaving the democratic part of the digital community hall. Over time, this number has only been going up. More problematic is that especially the young people seem very eager to get out of the room. So this is a wrong slideshow. That's going to be interesting. So that's the background for this initiative called the Nordic Think Tank for Tech and Democracy. We are 13 members from the 5 different Nordic countries and the 3 self-governing areas. We work as an expert council to come up with recommendations for how the Nordic government can enhance the democratic conversation and how we can make a unified response in the post-DSA era. So we start with the position that the DSA is here and will be the ground rules, but we need to work within this, and within this defend the democratic traditions and interests of the Nordic countries. So why the Nordic? And I think many different European countries might be thinking the same. Why will you want to go together? So basically, I've experienced a few times the Danish ministry trying to reach out to the tech giants and have a dialogue with it. And they're all very nice to each other. It just doesn't change anything. They're simply too big, and we are not talented enough. At the other side, we are seeing EU come out with some ground rules, the DSA, the DMA, but it's also too big. And to be honest, since I've been working with this for quite a number of years, I'm also realizing that we just don't agree. What might be a democratic good idea in Denmark might be a problem in Romania. When we want more moderation to protect our kids, we might be hurting a more vulnerable democracy of Italy, for example. So in that sense, 28 million citizens living in a similar open and trust-based democracy might just be the right area to figure out how our democracy should look in the future. And we are part of a long tradition. So I used to ask this question, how do you get an hour with the president of the biggest democracy in the world? Well, you call all your nice, cool friends, which also happens to be prime ministers in small Nordic countries, and you all meet up, and then he has exactly 1 hour for you. So this is the tradition of the Nordic countries. We go together when we're too small to actually get influence. The think tank will be working along 3 tracks, or have been working along 3 tracks, exploring solutions, exploring how we navigate within the boundaries set up by the DSA and other laws. Firstly, we are moving very dramatically into disinformation and misinformation. We might not have seen any serious attacks within the Nordic countries the last year, but we have seen frightening examples in the rest of the world. Most recently, Brazil, but also elections with nearby countries such as the US, United Kingdom with Brexit, Ireland and Spain have witnessed attacks in scale. Further, the latest breakthrough with AI, for example, ChatGPT, DALL-E, VALL-E, forecast the future where the extent and efficiency of such attack will increase dramatically. We've just recently seen it in India, where the Hindu National Party were able to move thousands of bots that generated artificially attacks on journalists with a few mouse clicks. That's a future that will dramatically change how we can have an open democracy. The second thing we look into is the lack of transparency and fear of biases within the sorting algorithms. And that constitutes an entire arena of worries. I think most recently exemplified by Elon Musk takes over Twitter, and the concern that a few politically invested individuals can now decide who gets to participate in our community hall and who are not allowed to speak. Thirdly, hate speech, verbal attacks, and the need for moderation. We conducted recently a study in Scandinavia that found that every 20th comment on Facebook constituted a verbal attack. Is that a lot? You can think about that every 20th comment from this chair would be a sentence saying, "You bloody idiot, fat pig," or "Why don't you leave the country?" It would be a very difficult community hall to talk in. Now I have to find the right one. Yes. So to summarize, legislation from the EU, especially DSA, will for the future constitute the ground rules for our digital democracy. While some had hoped for a more ambitious set of ground rules, less ambitious rules are better than no rules. And we are simply not facing the same challenges as democracy to make the rules more ambitious from a Scandinavian perspective. But while the ground rules might have been put down, this does not terminate the work to protect our democracies. A compromise as the DSA, because it's a compromise, contains many vague formulations with a lot of interpretation. Further, as we have seen, for example, with the GDPR, stating illegal rights only matters if possible violation and monitored are enforced. The same comments are going to come with the DSA. Navigating the post-DSA and getting the most from these ground rules is what the think tank's recommendation that will be revealed in April is all about. So we haven't decided on the recommendations, so this is only speaking on my own behalf. But what we are looking into is that we will try to develop coordination across the Nordic countries on how to interpret the DSA. We are looking into making a Christmas letter, which is something from the finance sector where you send out a letter for Christmas because it's going to be cozy and nice, asking all the tech industry to come back on a specific topic that are right now being debated in the Nordic countries. Finally, we're very important seeing a great importance that we establish ways for helping out researchers get access. The DSA opens up a lot of ways for researchers to gain access to data and insights into the social media platforms. But if the process are also very long and very difficult, and we fear if there's not like someone helping out, that this process will be lost. Finally, we see a future for a Nordic Center for algorithmic test and of technical basis, where we will try to develop ways of getting insights into one of the things that DSA is not helping right now, the algorithms driving the social media platforms. Thank you for the attention. So we'll now try to get some concrete examples of how this new regulation are affecting, or are seen to affect the discourse and democratic conversation from 3 different tech companies. We'll start out with Julia Maxwell, the Vice President of Regulatory and Public Affairs from Viaplay Group. Hi, Julia.
Perfect words.
Just take a seat. So, maybe you can say a little about Viaplay, because I remember it as kids, but maybe not everyone. And then also give us an insight into how do you see the new EU legislation that Eleanor has presented, provided what impact on content and discourse online do you see from Viaplay?
Okay. We have other people up first, or shall I just go for it?
Just go for it.
Okay, marvelous. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today and speak on behalf of Viaplay. I would love to think that Viaplay is as well known as Spotify and YouTube, but I suspect outside the Nordics, maybe not so much. So I'm going to explain very briefly who we are and what we do before getting on to sort of my specific comments, where I'm going to pick out a couple of points on the DSA and also the AVMS directive. So Viaplay is a European entertainment company. We are headquartered here in Stockholm, and we offer streaming services, TV channels, radio stations, and production companies. The jewel in our crown is our Viaplay subscription service, where we may have been inspired by Spotify in choosing that name. But we, in that service, which is direct-to-consumer, we offer the best of our Viaplay original content. Each year we spend hundreds of millions of SEK commissioning original storytelling in all the markets that we are present in. We also offer acquired content and movies, and we're very proud of our premium sports rights, which we have, which include the Premier League and the Formula One and Champions League. Viaplay is present in 5 Nordic markets. In fact, we have been available in the Nordics for 15 years with the previous name of Viasat On Demand. And a few years ago, we embarked upon a very ambitious expansion strategy. So we are now available in the Baltic markets, and last year we also launched in the Netherlands and in Poland. At Christmas we launched in the UK, and in March this year we will launch as a direct consumer offering in both the US and Canada. To be able to expand, we really want to be the European streaming champion, bring as much great original, whether it's Nordic or also original storytelling from the Baltics, the Netherlands, Poland, all markets that we're in. To be able to bring that to as many European markets as possible, we need sort of 3 key things when it comes to regulation. We need legal certainty when it comes to the application and consistent application of very important principles for us, which include the country of origin principle and territoriality. We need a level playing field when it comes to online players who compete with us for audience and for advertising spend. And we need effective, robust, and expeditious piracy tools which enable us to get our content removed as quickly as possible and protect the IPR that we spend so much money investing in. On that note, when it comes to the DSA, look, we all welcomed the political intention behind it and the ambition to modernize the regime for the liability of intermediary services and the challenge it was to balance conflicting fundamental rights. For us, we feel there was a missed opportunity when it came to the principle of know your business customer. The reason for that is, for us, our biggest problem with pirated content comes from illegal IPTV services. Today, there are around 2,500 copies of Viaplay channels and services on illegal IPTV services across the Nordics. There are 2 illegal IPTV services that have 50,000 plus users accessing Viaplay content. And that number is only increasing. If we had seen an extension of the KYBC, not just to online marketplaces, but actually all intermediaries, search engines, etc., they would not be able to advertise, they would not be listed in the rankings, and we would have immediately had, at least a good tool to help us get rid of those services. We obviously wait to see the impact of the notice and action regime and how that is implemented. But for us, we need expeditious removal of content, particularly live sports content, which, if it's not removed very, very quickly, loses all economic value for us. So we'll see how implementation goes. Very quickly on the AVMSD, again, here we obviously noted the inclusion of video sharing platforms and social media in certain parts of the AVMSD. However, for us, we've seen an increase in the sort of fragmentation in how it has been implemented. That's all of the AVMSD. And
I have to cut you off.
Okay,
sorry.
all right, sorry.
I said I was going to be strict.
It's going to be level playing
now.
field, but there you go.
So, thank you very much for coming up. Should we get clap her?
Thank you.
Okay, next living person is Sarah, who is on very short notice taking over for David, which plane were cancelled. Sarah is in Google and YouTube, and your title is?
Government Affairs and Public Policy
Thank
Manager.
you very much.
Yes.
So, Sarah, can you say a little? I think we all know your company, so maybe you don't need to say
Yes.
so much about that. But could you say a little about how the legislation is impacting content and discourse online from the perspectives of YouTube?
Yes, very briefly, YouTube is a global platform for user-generated content. So we have a mission to give everyone a voice and show them the world. And just for reference, plus 500 hours of video is uploaded to YouTube every minute. And so how do we think about our responsibility and how do we work with the legislative environment that is evolving in Europe? And with the mission of showing people, give everyone a voice and show them the world, there's also another very implicit responsibility, and that is to make sure that our users, whether they are the ones generating content, the ones wanting to learn something, the ones that want to be entertained, or anyone else, is also feeling safe and want to use YouTube as a platform. So the back side of the coin of giving everyone a voice and showing them the world is responsibility. And how do we do this? How do we protect the community at the same time as we enable new and diverse voices to break through? And we have chosen to frame this, and this is across Google's different products, but I will speak specifically for YouTube at the moment to make it a bit more clear. We call it the 4 R's. One is that we remove content that is illegal in Sweden or in any other European country, or that violates our policies. But as a platform, we have a global reach, and our policies are also for a global audience. And here I think the balancing exercise starts. How do we combine freedom of expression for a global user community and adhering to local laws and removing harmful content across EU or in the world? And we have to be honest and say that we don't always get it right. And some may say we do too much, and some may say we do too little. But in this exercise, we feel that we hopefully do something right, that we're on the right track. But that's also why it's very important for us to have the right to appeal. So one can, as a user, flag content that one thinks breaks the policies, and one can, as a creator, appeal decisions that we've taken. But just for reference, in the challenging times that we're in, and we've heard several speakers mention this, we removed, since the war in Ukraine started, we removed 9,000 channels and over 80,000 videos for violating our policies. We have raised, that's our second R, we have raised authoritative content when it matters the most. So in Ukraine, breaking news, the top news shelf, if you search for anything related to Ukraine, you get authoritative content from Ukraine, and we have over 100 million views of that at YouTube. We add to that information panels when something is happening, an election or COVID-19. We reduce the spread of borderline content. And one could ask, why can't we just not have that at all? But balancing freedom of expression and removing harmful content is difficult, I say that again. And we would like you to be able to still say what is your right, but we don't have to help you spread it. So that's why we have the reduce element. And then last but not least, nobody should be able to make money from bad content or from spreading information or for hating or violating anybody else's freedom. That's why we're very careful in who we allow to be rewarded by sharing the advertiser spent on YouTube, and that is only given to eligible creators and trusted partners. And I stay there because we have more things to discuss.
Thank you very much. Should we give her a hand too? Thank you, Sarah. It feels nice to clap, right? When you're sitting down for so long. Next living person is Olivia Regina, Senior Director and Head of European Policy at Spotify. Olivia, can you say a little about Spotify and then tell us about your view on the impact of content and discourse online from seen as Spotify?
Thank you very much. I think many of you know Spotify, so I'm not going to spend too much time explaining exactly how a service works. But I think I would just like to introduce by highlighting a couple of the specificities of Spotify as a service. First, Spotify is originally and mainly a provider of licensed content. That started with music, we've expanded with podcasts, audiobooks. We have also introduced some creators podcast that qualifies UGC, which makes us a bit of a hybrid platform of licensed content and UGC content, but we're coming mainly from a licensed background. A second point I wanted to stress is that while we have an ad-supported part of Spotify, the essence and business model of Spotify is subscription-based. So this means Spotify's goal is to provide relevant content for users, designed to their taste, but also make them discover new content, but it's not to amplify particular type of content, against ad revenues. The last point I wanted to highlight also is that we also are, as I explained, a distribution service, not a forum where our users exchange with each other. We are also an on-demand platform, which means that we're not linear, and we have a very exhaustive catalog. Actually, for music, it aims to be globally exhaustive, all the catalog. We have more than 80 million tracks of music. We have 4.7 million pieces of podcasts, for example. That gives you an idea of the quantity of content on Spotify, but the majority is licensed. In relation to the questions asked and the relevance of the different regulations, from an extent to another, they're all relevant to Spotify, whether it's copyright, whether it's the DSA, whether it's DMA and MFA. I would like to highlight actually one that maybe others will not highlight as much as us, is the importance of DMA. As the DMA regulates the relation between gatekeepers and services, actually, we see it as a very important tool to ensure competition, fair competition between services, but therefore fair competition means diversity of services. And in the field of content, that's also part of ensuring democracy. So that's a very important tool for us. DSA, relevant as well, and I think with that we welcome the fact that it provides an opportunity to create trust with users, with clearer rules, with a harmonization of regulation, very important as well. Copyright is, of course, relevant in the field of copyright content and creative content. And the MFA is relevant as well, where we have, I think there are a number of questions to be solved about the definitions of a media service provider versus a media provider, and other things that we may have an opportunity to discuss. Finally, if I still have a minute, I think I would like to highlight that for us, the importance of legislation is at the European level, first, that it provides harmonization. For all the services like us that provide services across borders, harmonized rules are extremely helpful. Second important point, clarity. Having clarity of the rules, consistent interpretation is extremely important to avoid, again, fragmented application of a European regulation, and also for businesses to understand how you can best, comply and ensure application. And then finally, I would say important to see the practical aspects of the rules. How do you practically implement? How do you make an effective change with the rules beyond providing, let's say, something that can be very heavy in terms of administrative burdens? I think it's important for us that you have practicality in the implementation. I will stop here for the sake of the rest of the panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's give a hand. And invite the last two panelists up here, Abba and Eleonora. You can maybe take here. So many people on the stair. So a question for both of you over here. We now have a lot of EU regulation, but I don't think it's stopping here. So I would very much like to ask you what lies ahead for tech regulation? And before you answer, I just want to say, after this question, we'll open up the floor. So if you have a question, be ready. I think there are mics there. And come down, just put up your hands. So what lies ahead now? What will be the next step?
I would like to answer this by following up on a very interesting point that was made by the Vice President of the European Commission in her intervention. That is why the instrument of a regulation was chosen instead of a directive for the most recent legislative proposals and then legislation. Of course, a directive is something that needs to be transposed at the national level. And she highlighted that there have been instances in which member states actually thought that they had a freedom that was not really there. So she specifically referenced cases of gold plating, etc. And this is something that I think is being seen very explicitly also with the most recent directives. I'm sure that Julia can provide examples from the AVMST, but I can say for in relation to the directive on copyright in the digital single market, that was a directive that was meant to create a digital single market. And if we look at the national transpositions that are available, member states have been moving in very different directions, with the paradoxical result that there might be more fragmentation now than what was the case before. So for sure, this complexity, this fragmentation is what lies ahead, and I think that the Court of Justice will need to be asked to provide guidance, and will likely do so, and indeed send some member states back to the drawing board because the transpositions that they did were not allowed under EU law. But all this, and then I conclude, if we look also at the regulations, it's not that necessarily they are the end of the road and they solve any of all the problems that lie with directives. Because if we take also the Digital Services Act, what is illegal content is something that will need to be defined on a national basis, and this might lead to divergent approaches also across the European Union, with the result that internet actors will need probably to adopt geo-blocked solutions in order to comply with local laws. So complexity is the result of the complex technical framework in which this legislation came to be, and is likely to be also the future, at least for the forthcoming few years.
Thank you. Do we have a question from out here? Okay, then I will...
Maybe you want me to mention
I think I have another question, because I've been eager to ask you about this.
Okay.
I couldn't sleep yesterday thinking about this. So we have seen, you brought us the DSA, which is so exciting news. But what do you stand with left after a long negotiation, a lot of things where you probably got some of your dreams fulfilled and some you didn't? What are like the big democratic problems that the DSA didn't solve? What are you still expecting to look into in the future?
I mean, the DSA is not a quick fix for what is bad online, and I think we have to be open about it. I think it solves some of the more urgent things where our laws are not, our current laws that we have nationally and on a European level have not been implemented as they should online. That's what the DSA is tackling. It's making a new standard online. And I mean, now, of course, there are other new upcoming laws that are trying to tackle more specific things that are touching online. But online is sort of part of our society. We do everything online. And some of the laws that are coming up right now, that I would say I don't think they are as good and balanced as the DSA was and is, are of course more of the controlling data, for example, Data Act, AI Act, of some legislations that are coming up in controlling data. Other things also touching online is about what to do on advertising online. Advertising online was something that was discussed also in the DSA, and I'm happy that I managed to make sure that we have not banned advertising online, because it's crucial both for democracy and business. But those conflicts are now going to a new law on tackling political advertising. And that will also have a big impact in digitalization and the online environment. And I think that's an example of a law that had good intention, but is right now making more very difficult for online advertising, and especially more small medias across Europe that will be overburdened with a lot of the bureaucracy, and where the intention now is that they will have difficulties to continue their important work.
Thank you. Do we have any questions from out there? It's a little difficult to see with the light. Okay, I warned you, it'll be more and more critical questions coming from here. There's one here. Yes. Please state your name and.
Yes, of course. Thank you. My name is Greg Pollard. I'm the Director General of ACT. I'll be speaking. You're not our moderator tomorrow, but you're doing a great job. My question goes to the representative from YouTube. On 6th of January 2021, as you know, we had the dreadful events that happened in the US. And all the platforms after this said, we will be doing our maximum to make sure this never happens again. We've understood our lesson, we see what's going on. And of course, the work of the updated code of practice, etc. And yet, 2 years after that, almost to the day, the same events unfolded in Brazil. In your opinion, what is it that happened? Is it that the lessons were not learned, that application was not made? I'm not putting it on YouTube, but I'm saying generally, where do you think the platforms have failed there and why? And what can they do? Thank you.
I'm almost prone to say that I have to pass that question because I am standing in for David, who was traveling here from the UK. So maybe I can come back to you on that one? No, I promise, not in 2 years. This week.
We'll send a mail later. Is there any other question? Okay, then I'll ask the three over here.
Yes, yeah. I have a comment on Arba's, or your question also, what's next? And what we see is more or less like an unprecedented amount of different legislative proposals that is coming from the European Commission. And this is not to say that we oppose them. Our CEO says that for AI, for example, it's too important not to be regulated, but it also needs to be regulated in the right way. And here we see that when we continue to regulate areas where the previous regulation has not really come into effect yet, we are still working on and looking forward to adhere to our obligations within the DSA, and we're working very closely with the Commission on the Code of Disinformation as part of that. We just see that there are still unclarities, and there are areas where these regulations conflict with each other. And in the light of this, I can just only agree with you, Arba, on the concerns around political ads. Because since the last European election, you have to register to be able to place an ad, you have to be transparent on how much you spend, and you need to be placed in that country to be able to advertise against that population. And with the political ads, we thought that, okay, that's great, now we get a legislation adhering to these codes of conduct and practices. But what we're now seeing and what we're very concerned about is that the definition of a political ad is becoming so broad that it could more or less mean any political speech. And that is very worrying from our point of view.
Thank you. I think I'll ask Eleonora. So the experience that the legislation is becoming broader and more vague, is that a general development or?
Yes and no, because at the end of the day, there is also the concern to write something that doesn't become outdated in 2-3 years' time. So as a matter of necessity, there needs to be these general clauses, these general principles that, of course, then, present a legislation that might be quite thin in substance, and this flesh will need to be added through practice, practical applications, case law, and guidance coming from courts. And here I repeat once again, perhaps I'm obsessed, but it will come from the Court of Justice of the European Union for sure, which as a court has not been shy at all in adding a lot of flesh to some of the most important pieces of legislation adopted over the past few years. Let's think about again, the copyright framework, the GDPR. There have been some decisions that have actually made what the law says and should say.
Thank you. Julia, when she introduced herself, said that she expressed a concern of being in the old media sector, and that often you feel that the old media sector have a lot of regulation, whereas some of the new tech areas are moving much faster, and the level playing field is simply not there. Is it something you're focusing on in going forward, that you have to move up the old industries?
No, I would not agree with that perception. You have to have in mind that the audiovisual sector is more older and have had longer time to evolve than social media. The social media is relatively new and have been unregulated. So basically what DSA is sort of the first big step to have a proper law when it comes to social media, while the AVS sector have already had regulations that have been developed across with the business sector. And I'm not sure if the DSA will be the only or the last. No, as I mentioned, there are several other laws that are coming up that will affect what's going on also on social media. It could be on the Media Freedom Act, the political ads, it could be the AI Act and other things that will affect social media. So I would not say that the AVS sector is more overburdened with laws. I would say we have a huge problem in general, that we have too overburdened bureaucracy when it comes to the laws. And I think that we, from the EU level, and especially the EU Commission, needs to find ways to reduce bureaucracy and overburden towards our business sectors.
Thank you very much.
Tobias, could I?
Back.
Yeah.
We have a question here in the back, whenever you get a chance.
Yes, 2 seconds.
No, I just want to briefly pick up. I think we dispute the old bit. I mean, yes, my company has been operating TV channels for 35 years, but that's been under regulation that was successful. It meant, lots and lots of media services were able to broadcast to all countries across Europe, helping media pluralism, and our streaming service is 15 years old, but it was very, very innovative and sort of launched when Netflix was still posting DVDs. So old, I'm not sure is the right
Sorry about that.
categorization. Yeah. But in terms of burden, what we see is because we're in a known quantity, because we're licensed, we're also quite an easy target. And I think with convergence, sometimes we see policymakers maybe misunderstanding how we operate, how much regulation we comply with. If we breach our licenses, we're either fined, it's published, and we could lose them. So we have to be very, very careful that we're adhering to the standards set for us. We don't necessarily see that in other spheres. And what we see is the temptation to add more and more rules and requirements. With the AVMSD, we see that now in many markets we're looking at levies or investment obligations. For a European service like us, and we're quite small, looking at which countries to go into, we have to now take into account, well, are we going to suddenly fall into the scope for a levy of a certain percent or an investment obligation? We want to go in, we want to commission great content because consumers won't subscribe if we don't have great content. But we're the experts in editorial content. We're the experts in taking risk and commissioning great stories. So we just want to be able to get on with our jobs with less administrative burden that these new rules will put on us.
Yep.
So I learned never to say a company is old or a sector is old. Thank you. Is that for this?
Very quick point, actually, in relation to this. I think we hear very often, that some existing legislation should be extended to new services. And just to make the point, I think it's important to not extend legislation to new services, but deal with new services for what they are. You don't regulate an on-demand service in the same way as you regulate a linear service. You don't regulate a social media in the same way as you regulate a distribution service. So just to flag that I think certain services need to be regulated more or less actually for what they are, and the new ones need to be addressed for what they are, but not necessarily in a comparative manner.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we had a question all the way back. Is that right?
My name is Andrea Liebman. I'm with the Swedish Psychological Defense Agency. I'm curious about when the West regulates its information environments and puts up laws. I'm not sure who this is directed towards, perhaps Sarah or Arba or Eleonora. If you've considered other platforms, social media platforms like Telegram, Odyssey, BitChute, we have sort of video streaming platforms where antagonist actors have a chance to spread propaganda, and this is entirely not regulated. How do you foresee sort of development in that arena? And the West regulates, and then we have other parts that are not regulated and can perhaps also create their own types of regulation that is non-democratic. Thank you.
Okay, so that's a question for Alba about how do we do when we are seeing this decentralization and we are seeing the small platforms not being regulated?
Yeah, I mean, that's always the risk. As I said, DSA cannot solve every problem that we have online, and we had to have a distinction between the very large platform, medium-sized, small, and micro. So we have exemption for the small and micros, and then we have less provisions for the medium-sized, and the big, very large platform have much more provisions. We discussed, and all other kind of platforms, both the messaging services as well, like Telegram and WhatsApp and others. But in the end, I mean, should we go in and see what people write to each other? I mean, that's, I would say that would not be a way going forward when it comes to freedom of speech. So I understand that, of course, people who want to do harm and do criminal things will find their way, but it's important that we have a proper law when it comes to the intermediary services, that the law was its purpose, and that we balance these kind of interests on freedom of speech online and also safety.
Okay. More questions from the audience? Yeah. Can we get a microphone?
I'm working on it.
Brilliant.
Per Wolf from EUR. I'll try to keep it short. Looking into the future, into the glass bowl, we have the metaverse coming up, some sorts. And as Olivia, I guess, said, you have to take a service for what it is. So what do you think it will be? And is regulation ready for the metaverse, whatever shape it will take? It might be several shapes, but it is coming up, and I think it's more than just a buzzword. So I'll be interested to have your view on regulating the metaverse.
I think you're the only regulator up here.
Was it on me again?
Yeah, I guess so.
I mean, I like new technologies. Let the innovators, innovate. And why do we need to regulate everything? And my purpose was that we will have a DSA that would be also future-proof. So we don't have to have this kind of laws every 5 years. But I mean, I hope that we will not need to regulate. We will do it when it's needed, but not because it's fun. So.
Okay. With that answer, I think we will end this session. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you for the panelists.
Thank you.
Well done.